Well, welcome along, everyone. You've done well to find us. How many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, well, there'll be plenty of good, intimate discussion at the end. What we thought we would do in this session, which is really all about publishing and editing and ethics and the medical literature generally, is leave all the questions to the end. So if you do have any burning things, then save them till that point. Now, I'll introduce myself. I'm Anna Fenton. I'm a gynae endocrinologist from New Zealand. I'm the immediately deceased co-editor-in-chief of Climacteric. Nick Pane and I were in that job until about 18 months ago before Rod and his group of associate editors took over. So we've also got, as well as Rod, we've got Robin Bell, who's currently an associate editor as well. So you've got a group of people here this morning who have been involved in the manuscript and publishing area for a wee while. So we're going to start with, I guess, a presentation from me that's very much focused on those of you starting out in the research business and perhaps looking to publish for the first or second time. Because I think it often seems that the road towards getting your paper accepted is littered by extreme obstacles, the main purpose of which is to stop your paper being accepted. And I'm hoping that just by following a few really simple rules that will seem very obvious to you, hopefully, and learning that editors and reviewers are actually on your side, they're trying to make your paper as good as it can possibly be, that journey towards paper acceptance is not quite as arduous as it might seem. So, why do we publish? Well, I guess it's one of those fundamental things that those of us who do research do. It's a necessary part of the whole scientific process. For some people, there may be personal reasons why they're publishing in terms of career progression or graduating. But at the end of the day, the things that journals and their editors want to receive are new and original results or methods, reviews of a hot topic, and manuscripts generally that advance the knowledge in an area. Now that seems really obvious, but it's not uncommon for us to receive reports that are out of date, perhaps of no scientific interest, that duplicate previous work or come to invalid conclusions. So it really starts with having a good research project to begin with, having thought carefully about what you're doing, because you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. If you've done bad research, it's very hard to write that up and make it sound good. And certainly at the editorial board meeting this morning, there was some discussion about how the IMS and Climacteric could help with study design so that you've got the good data there to actually progress on. So, coming back to those personal reasons why you might be publishing, certainly when Nick and I were involved with Climacteric, we would receive letters every now and again, usually from students, imploring and begging us to publish their paper. And whilst, you know, it's obviously very important for them, at the end of the day, when we receive the manuscripts, it's the content of the paper that counts, not the reason that it's being sent in. So, probably the very first step to take when you're thinking of publishing, you have your data there, you're beginning to start writing up, you have to think about where you're going to send it. And there are a huge variety of journals out there. But I guess the tips in terms of getting it into a good one is obviously look at all the candidate journals in your area that are ethical and peer-reviewed. And you can't describe all journals in that way. But when you've got a small list of potential candidates, then go onto their website and have a look at their aims and their scope, so you get an idea of the kind of manuscripts that they publish. Look at the kind of articles they've accepted recently, what their current hot topics are, because that will tell you very much in what direction the area is trending. Have a look at their readership. You know, is this a journal that has a wide-based membership of people from all walks of medical or scientific life, or is it held by a group of elite, high-powered academics? You may want to look at the impact factor. The impact factor is the holy grail of an editor's life. It's the way a journal is ranked every year, and a calculation is made based on the average number of citations per manuscript. And it's something that, as I say, you know, every editor lives and dies on every year about this time. Climacteric and most of the other journals in this area sit in the 2 to 3 impact factor level, which puts them in the top 20 to 30% of journals overall. Now, that shouldn't be your sole criteria when you're trying to find a journal that's appropriate for your paper, because obviously the higher that impact factor, the more elite the journal and the more picky they will be. If you've got something absolutely earth-shattering, then go for the highest impact you can find. But I think don't use that as your sole criteria for chasing a journal. Now, the next thing to have a look at on the website of your chosen journal is their guide to authors. And you'll hear me repeating this a few times because it is a really good idea to read that guide again and again and again, because it's really much easier to start writing your manuscript based on the accepted structure of that journal. It's really tedious to go back at the end of the day and have to restructure it to the appropriate format. So the things that will catch an editor's eye as the paper comes across their desk or through their inbox are basically manuscripts that are brief, that are clear, and that are valid. And I think increasingly with time over the 10 years that I was involved in Climacteric, the submissions just got longer and longer. So keeping it brief, keeping it clear, and making sure you've come to valid conclusions. Now, obviously, there's going to be a quick first glance that an editor takes at a paper when it comes in, and the title's usually the first thing they read. So if you're describing the results of a randomised controlled trial, that needs to be included in the title, and you need to keep the title short and sharp. We don't want a short story masquerading as a title. And sometimes we've got titles so long that they would almost be as long as the introduction. Obviously, the subject needs to be novel. Editors want to excite their readers. They want something that's new, that hasn't been published somewhere else. And they want it presented in a logical way. So it's really important that the editor very quickly, when they're doing that first scan of your paper, grasps the importance of what you're trying to say. Because if you lose them, you probably have lost the deal at that point. So sometimes, particularly if you're publishing in an area that may be quite a small area, writing a good covering letter, setting out to the editor why you think your research is important can actually be quite helpful. Now, in that first scan, editors will also potentially take an instant dislike to your paper if it's badly written, if it rambles, if there are lots of spelling and grammatical mistakes. And I think we all recognise that a lot of people are writing in English when it's not their first, second or even their third language. And we totally accept and understand that. But I think these days, everyone has colleagues who speak English well. There are really good grammar and editing services out there that can take your paper and just get rid of those odd little things that often stand out on that first read. And somewhat surprisingly, we do, I don't know whether you still do, Rod, but certainly in our time we had manuscripts sent to Climacteric about building bridges and mechanical engineering topics. So I'm not quite sure how they decided on midlife women's health as being an appropriate journal, but that's obviously an easy decline. So at the end of the day, in terms of these very general, simple things, your research may be absolutely fabulous in every way, but if you lose the editor quickly with simple errors, then you're kind of sunk. And it's surprising how frequently some of these errors do crop up. As you can see, the poorly written, poorly presented papers are not uncommon. So when we start to then drill down, so the editor has had a general glimpse at your paper, quick read through, then they'll start to read it a bit more carefully. So you need to write that introduction very carefully. It should be a clear, short, unbiased review of where the literature sits at the present time. You need to state your aim and you need to motivate the editor, but ultimately your audience, to keep reading that. And I think one of the good tips that I got was think of your introduction as 3 paragraphs. So in the first paragraph, you describe what the current situation or level of understanding in this particular area might be. In the second paragraph, talk about the problem that you perceive exists or a controversy. And then in the third paragraph, how your study is going to fix that. So that's kind of an easy protocol to follow. Your next bit's going to be methods. So again, if you're presenting the results of an RCT, make sure you've followed the consort guidelines. They're very clearly stated on the consort website. Consort, if you haven't heard of them, is the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials. And they provide you with a checklist and flowcharts that you can include in the paper. And there was some discussion this morning about whether we should be requiring adherence to the Prospero guidelines for those who are presenting meta-analyses. So that's something that Rod and Robin and the others currently involved may wish to take further. The results should be short and they should be really clear. And again, we get a lot of manuscripts where when you see the printed version of the tables that are included in the results, they cover page after page after page. And in the interests of, saving space in journals, often, they're not going to make the paper copy. With many people reading online only these days, that's becoming less of an issue. But you just need to be aware that big tables will send us all to sleep. So if you can summarise a table, great. If you can present it in a visually impactful way, such as a graph, that's good too. Something that's simple and easy for us to take on board. And the discussion is where you kind of wrap it all up. So you need to restate the outcome of your research and then add value to that. Talk about the limitations of the study. Don't be fooled into thinking you have created the perfect study, because all have limitations, so you need to be honest about that. And then talk about where you're going to take the research next. Now, the last bit of the paper, apart from the references, are two of the most important bits, and Rod's going to talk about this in a bit more detail. They're often only a line or two, but it is really important that you acknowledge anyone who's had anything to do with the study design or writing the manuscript, particularly any link with funding bodies, whether it's government bodies or pharmaceutical companies. And obviously having someone ghostwrite your manuscript is something that's frowned on. Now, you will finally get to the end where you're pretty proud of what you've put together. Now, you then have to kind of take a step backwards and be knocked back down slightly by sharing your manuscript with some of your colleagues who will come back to you with all sorts of comments that you may find irritating at the time. But at the end of the day, they all add something useful to your paper to make it as good as it can possibly be. And I think it's really accepting that writing a manuscript takes time. It's not something that you can knock off in a day or two. It will take a while to revise it again and again to get it as good as it can be. So you've sent it off to the manuscript, to the journal. The journal's come back to you with some decision about whether they're going to accept it with modifications, or decline it. Now, if you've got the opportunity to reply to the editor, then it's always a good idea to be polite if you want to publish in that journal again. The editors are usually trying to be very constructive, but they will give you a copy of the reviewer's comments and you need to answer those concerns. If the reviewers have made a comment that you think is wrong and that with your superior knowledge of this particular area you need to address, then reference that and write back to them stating why you've done what you've done. And obviously if they make a good point, then accept that graciously and keep that short too. So you'll see short appearing a few times in this presentation. Now, again, Rod will sort of cover the ethics of publishing, but if you've got your paper published and you do discover there's been a mistake somewhere, it is important that you let the editor know that. Even if it's a small mistake that you can correct, it's better to correct it than leave it published as an error under your name. If you discover there's been some serious issues with data collection or the way it's been analysed, then the entire paper needs to be retracted. But, for many of us, we redo analysis using different methodology or bigger numbers further down the track, and it is entirely okay to publish what might be quite different results to the initial manuscript some years earlier. So, I think in summary, good writing takes time, and I think accepting that all manuscripts need polishing and that this process of working with your colleagues and working with the editorial team is really important. Read and follow the instructions to authors for the journal that you've chosen. Make sure your manuscript's been proofread, particularly if English is not something you're too familiar with. Get advice, and you'll find that editors are generally very friendly people. We're always keen to get good manuscripts, and we will go out of our way to help you with anything that you are querying. Our job really is to make your manuscript as publishable and as readable as it can be. So keep that in the back of your mind, and do talk to us and to the other members of the editorial board of a journal if you do have any queries. So I think I will finish there.
My name's Rod Baber. I'm the current editor-in-chief of Climacteric. And today I'm going to talk to you a bit about ethics, the ethics of medical research really, and the role of the journal and the editor in that as well. First of all, a few words about Climacteric. It's an international peer-reviewed journal. It publishes high-quality original research and we accept all of those different categories. But as Anna mentioned, we are particularly interested in original research articles and reviews. Everything that is submitted to Climacteric, including invited reviews, is peer-reviewed because that's, I think, the critical step in proper publication of good research which upholds the integrity of the authors and the journals. And I'll say a bit more about the reviewing process in a little while. So as Anna mentioned, publishing in a peer-reviewed journal will validate your work. It will alert others around the world to your work. It'll therefore enable you to develop a dialogue with others who are doing similar things. It'll help all of us to solve problems, to find novel solutions to complexities that we didn't understand before. It'll help you to be a better clinician. And I think it will enrich your clinical practicing life. If all you do is just be a clinician, that's great, but if you can fit some research and some publishing into it, it will enrich your professional life. And if you have any hankering for academia, it'll definitely help your career. But only if you do everything ethically and you are able to withstand thorough scrutiny. It's true, there is an adage that says publish or perish, but you will perish faster if you publish lies or somebody else's data masquerading as your own. So you need to remember that at all times. There are a number of particularly important ethical issues which I'll expand upon a bit as we go through this talk. But first and foremost is the scientific integrity of the paper. Secondly, the funding sources. Thirdly, competing or conflicting interests that you or other authors may have. Potential biases of all sorts. The issue of authorship, Anna said some titles take up a page. Well, some lists of authors take up a page as well. And you need to reflect on that. There are certainly critical measures which entitle you to authorship of a paper. And the other ethical issues, of course, are the ones I mentioned at the beginning, which are the editor in the journal and, of course, peer review. And you might think, well, you know, that's pretty important, but probably a lot of this only applies to journals that have got a sort of impact factor of 2 or 3 or 1 even, but it applies to all journals. And if you want to think of one paper where you think some of these issues may not have been carried out as thoroughly as they could have been in the last 15 or 20 years, then you could think of WHI, where there were all sorts of flaws in the first paper. And there were certainly changes to the long-term data, but never retractions. So there are some fundamental ethical issues. Data fabrication is one, making up the research findings. There are some extraordinary examples of that. There are some that came from Australia, my country, that I can remember well, where the man who identified thalidomide as a cause of many birth defects then tried to identify another drug, but he made up the results. So his career, which was stellar, for a short time, plummeted until he was forced to retire. Falsification of data is another major problem. You can manipulate the data, often by using inappropriate statistics to make a false impression. You shouldn't duplicate submissions. We all understand that you want to submit your paper to the best journal you can, but you shouldn't submit it to 2 or 3 or 4 journals at the same time. And just because one journal rejects your work doesn't mean others will. Your work may be more appropriate for another journal, and the advice you've received from the reviewers in the first journal may well be helpful to you, but also to the editor of another journal to whom you submit your work. There's this thing called salami publications, where you split your work into several bits so that you can get a bit published in this journal and this journal and this journal, and this still goes on. And we look for that a lot to try and eliminate it as much as we possibly can. But you should also try to avoid doing this. You should also make sure that copyright has never been breached. I'm afraid often we see papers published with a table or a figure which is taken from another journal publication, which has not been authorised, and we have to send it back. And lastly, of course, you need to inform the institution where your work has been done so that they know what's going on as well. I should mention plagiarism, which is duplication of text and figures, including your own. So it can be verbatim copying of another's work and submitting it as your own. It can be verbatim copying of significant portions of the text from a single source. It can be mixing up verbatim, which is copied material from multiple sources, patchworking. You can change keywords and phrases, but retain the essential content of the source. You can mix slightly rephrased material from multiple sources and present that as something which is new and which you've done. And you can cite work, but the cited portions are not clearly identified. So you need to be careful of that. And most scientific journals have software, as well as editors and associate editors and peer reviewers, who are able to check for that sort of thing. Plagiarism is always screened for. I mentioned authorship. There are 4 critical criteria for authorship. One is that the author should make a substantial contribution to the concept of the work, to the acquisition, analysis and interpretation of the data. The author should be involved in any drafting or revising of the work. The author definitely should grant final approval. And if you don't already know, that was certainly one of the problems with the original WHI paper, where many of the original investigators did not see the original paper before it was published. There should be agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work by ensuring that questions about the integrity of any part of that work are investigated and resolved. And that, again, did not happen with WHI. And the author, as Anna has said, the author's other primary responsibility is choosing the appropriate journal. And I'm sure you're all like me. I get daily, hourly invitations to publish from journals that at first I think I've heard of, and then I realise it's just a name that's similar to a name I've really heard of. And they tell me how desperately they want my work. Some of them even tell me I can make my topic up if I want to. That's how desperately they want it. But there's usually a fee for these. They often claim to be ICMJE journal members, and they're not. They will pretty well publish everything. They infer that peer review takes place, and very often it does not. Those journals are not an accepted part of our scientific community, and publication in those journals won't advance the cause of science or your career. And that's the job of the editor to work that out. It's not that hard. And then there's conflict of interest. So these are the motherhood statements. Public trust in the scientific process and the credibility of published articles depends in part on fully transparent handling of conflicts of interest throughout the publishing process. And a conflict of interest exists when professional judgment concerning a primary interest, such as the patient's welfare and the validity of your research, may be influenced by a secondary interest, such as financial gain or academic promotion. Conflict of interest could involve authors, participants, peer reviewers, editors, or journal staff. And the one message I would give you above all else is it's better to declare everything. It's more important to declare everything than to leave things out. Climacteric recommends the ICMJE form for disclosures of conflicts of interest. But we've also taken the step that we, and we're going to approach other journals as well, will write to ICMJE and ask them to change their guidelines on conflict of interest so that you have to declare any source of funding. At present, you do not have to declare government funding or fundings from charitable institutions. And we believe that any source of funding is a potential cause for conflict of interest, and it should be declared. Potential outside influences are important. All your funding sources, as I said, should be important. Relationship with the sponsors, no matter who they might be. And certainly your financial relationships. We don't want you writing a paper about neurokinin B receptor blockers if you have shares in the company that's developing them, for example, not unless you declare it. We don't, as Anna mentioned, like you to have help from professional writers, and we certainly don't want you to have ghost writers. And I do acknowledge this is an English language journal, and much of our submission comes from countries where, as Anna said, English is not first, second or third language. We'll do what we can to help you, and as you were told, there are also good aids on the internet which will help you to get your papers into English. But we are keen to publish, and we'll help you in any way we can. And you must ensure that any agreement with your sponsors doesn't prevent free access to data. And that's been an ongoing sore for a long time, where you carry out research on what everybody, including the sponsor, thinks is a really promising product, and you find out that either it has no benefit or it causes harm. And you must make sure when you enter into your agreements at the beginning that you are able to publish your findings, whether they are good, bad, or indifferent. What about the editor? The editor has ethical responsibility to ensure that each submission is fairly assessed by him or by her for scientific content, for originality, for ethical practice, and for relevance to the journal. And I haven't got any bridge building papers submitted, but we certainly do get some where it's clear that it should have gone to another journal. The editor has to select appropriate peer reviewers, and it's my opinion that the peer reviewer is the cornerstone of the whole scientific publishing process. And those peer reviewers must ensure timeliness, a good, quick response, an adequate and fair review, and also must declare any conflicts of interest which they may have. The editor has to ensure that the paper's confidentiality is maintained. Nothing should leak from the editor, from the journal staff, or from the reviewers. The editor has to make sure that he or she has complete editorial freedom, and although Climacteric is the journal of the International Menopause Society and owned by IMS, the editorial team have complete freedom to publish whatever they like. The editor has to ensure protection of each research participant. So we do our best to make sure that any trials that we are sent, that the patients in those trials are properly cared for and that their freedom is respected at all times. Just a few words about peer review. It's the endeavour of one researcher to offer another researcher advice about the acceptability of a concept, an idea, or an activity. So it's reciprocal. And that's how you should view it if you are asked to peer review. You're not there to tear a paper to pieces. You're there to help the submitter of that paper try and make it as acceptable as possible and as good as possible for publication. Peer review asks experts in the field to validate the content of a paper or to improve the content prior to publication. And it is, as I said, a great responsibility which is critical to the whole process. It's not perfect, however, And there are all sorts of issues which peer reviewers must also acknowledge, including conflicts of interest, conflicts of perspective, different belief systems, their backgrounds, their ethnicities, and even, dare I say it, academic chances. For example, a peer reviewer from the same institution as the author may seek to either block the paper to improve the reviewer's own chances, or to promote the paper if that person is one of their favoured few. Peer review should help you, the author, to improve your paper and therefore your chances of publication. And if you peer review, it will improve your CV and it will improve your chances of being invited at some stage to join an editorial advisory board, which is also good for your CV, for your academic progress, and for your understanding of the whole process. There are a few key points to being a reviewer. One is that you should have the necessary expertise, and if you don't, tell us. If we ask you to peer review and you feel you can't do it, I would prefer you wrote back and said, look, I can't do this, but my key interests are this, 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 and this. And then we'll know how to direct future reviews to you. Show some respect. Don't just read the abstract, read the paper. I will have looked at it before it gets to you, and so will one of the associate editors. But look at the paper, read it thoroughly, look at the tables, look at the charts, check the conclusions, look at the statistics. If you are not happy with the statistics, Climacteric provides a peer review tick box where you can say, I think this paper's okay, but I'm not sure about the statistics, and we will send it for you for independent statistical review. Be fair. Remember that the person writing the paper is somebody just like you who's trying to do the right thing. Be constructive, be inclusive, be balanced, and please be timely. If it was your paper, you would want feedback from the journal as soon as possible. And we do set time limits on our reviews, but very often they struggle to do so. I would encourage you, as soon as you're asked to do a peer review, do it. And last but not least, volunteer. The scourge of all editors is finding peer reviewers. And if you think you are qualified, we'd love to hear from you. I just wanted to show you the flowchart of what happens. When you submit a manuscript, it goes for administrative screening. Then it comes to me. And at this point, I might reject it because it's inappropriate or the science is no good or there's some sort of ethical issue. If I'm reasonably happy, I will then send it to one of our associate editors who have geographic bases around the world. And they might also reject it at this stage, or they might choose to send it to the peer reviewers. The peer reviewers will return their reviews to the associate editor, who will then make a recommendation to me, and that might be accept, a minor revision, a major revision, or reject. And it's at that stage that I will then make a final decision based on the advice that I've been given. The average time for us is about 30 days to get through all that process. And in terms of monitoring and ethical considerations, then it will happen with administrative screening, it will happen when I get it will happen when the associate editor gets it, it'll happen when the peer reviewers get it, and when it finally comes back to me, it'll happen again. So we do our very best to make sure your paper is as good as possible and as ethical as possible at the same time. So my conclusions are that research is essential to advancing science and improving healthcare. The publication of research allows us to promote science in the broader community, to collaborate with our colleagues, and to improve our practice. It's the responsibility of all of us involved in scientific research and publication to ensure that that research is conducted ethically, that proper statistical analysis is conducted, that authorship is granted only to those who've appropriately contributed, that there's no falsification, plagiarism, duplication, or breach of copyright, that all conflicts of interest or even potential conflicts of interest are declared, that peer review is fair, expert and timely, and that confidentiality is maintained. Climacteric's current impact factor is 2.271. The 5-year impact factor is 2.18, and we welcome your submissions. Thanks very much.
So my talk is called What is Wrong with the Medical Literature and What Can We Do About It? And in future, Rod, I'll put all my sources of funding on there, but I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. I've included this picture from the International Space Station because I just wanted to make the point that my talk is about the medical literature overall. It doesn't apply just to the journal Climacteric. So this is a very sort of generic talk about the medical literature. And I wanted to make 2 points about what I think is wrong with the medical literature at the moment. And I think this is a feeling that you've probably all had of absolutely drowning in the amount of literature that's available. So the first major problem I think we have is one of quantity. And this graph just shows the increase in the growth in open access content, particularly in PubMed, over the last few years. And you can just see that the volume of literature is increasing very, very quickly. The number of publications is just beyond what anyone could possibly consider covering. I just want to make a point at this stage that I think there is a problem with the increase in the number of systematic reviews that are being published and an increase in meta-analyses. And the relative increase in the publication of these types of publications is far outstripping just the increase in all PubMed indexed items. And I'll come back to this later, but it has been estimated that there are now more systematic reviews of trials being published annually than there are new trials. So if you come away from my talk with any one message, it's that I think everyone should read this paper by John Ioannidis, which is called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. It's still the most highly cited paper in PLOS medicine. I think we need to think very carefully about why poor quality medical research matters. And I think it matters for a number of reasons, but probably the most important ones are that it has the potential to harm patients if the science is incorrect. It can certainly derail the direction of research, and it can contribute to an enormous waste of resources. And the estimate of the amount of research investment that's wasted is really considerable. So this publication from the Lancet series of early 2014 put the estimate at 85% of research investment being wasted. So what's contributing to why most published research findings are false? And the list of things that can contribute to this is long. And you've heard some of these things already, but they include poor design, poor analysis, bias in the study, low study power, fraud, and the thing that John Ioannidis has published a lot about, which is low pre-study probability. But all of these things and others which I haven't specified all lead to the problem of low study reproducibility. I think this issue of poor reproducibility in research is very interesting because it's now become a science in its own right. So it's like research is studying research, so we have sort of a new meta-science. And this paper, which was published in Nature in 2016, talked about the results of interviews of scientists about whether they thought lack of reproducibility was a problem. And just over half of them said they thought there was a real crisis in reproducibility of research, and about 38% said there was a slight crisis. I don't know how you can have a slight crisis, but the overall message is that the vast majority of scientists think we've got a problem with reproducibility. So I think this isn't a new idea. I think people actually have a feeling that this is a problem. So I've been trying to think about how to understand this issue because I think we need to understand the drivers if we're going to formulate an approach to how to deal with it. So I think there are fundamentally external drivers, which I've listed on the right, and internal drivers, which I've put on the left. And I think traditionally we've thought that the external drivers are the ones that are particularly important, so now I've put them there in red. So things like research metrics, the publish or perish message, counting numbers of publications on CVs by employers and granting bodies. So this is the sort of thing that we've heard about from Anna and Rod. So this is a quote from Peter Lawrence from Cambridge. He says, hype your work, slice the findings up as much as possible. 4 papers are good, 2 papers aren't enough. Compress the results because most top journals have little space, so a typical letter to Nature now has the density of a black hole. Simplify your conclusions, but complexify the whole process because it's going to be more difficult for reviewers to fault it. Clearly he was being satirical when he wrote this. But if this is the issue, then we need to change the way we judge a CV. We shouldn't just be counting numbers of publications. And again, John Ioannidis's group has put forward a new system by which we could reward publication. And they've called it the PQRST index. And those letters stand for productivity, quality, reproducibility, sharing and translation. And with productivity, we should be looking at the percentage of a person's publications that are in top-tier journals and judged by citation, so judging by impact. We need to work out what we consider to be appropriate measures of quality. Again, we get back to this issue of reproducibility, which is so important. Sharing of both data and protocols, and I think this is going to be a very important direction for the future, and translation, like what difference have you made to either practice or policy? Again, this is part of this sort of meta-science where now scientists are studying their own research process. So this was a publication from PNAS from 2017 where they looked at what they could determine were the most important drivers of bias in research. And interestingly, what they found was that the most likely sources of bias were small studies performed by early career researchers who were not working in close groups. So the problems were situational, there was lack of mutual control, which you would get from a group, and problems with individual integrity. And the sort of things that people were tending to do include these, and I'm sure these are all concepts that you're familiar with, but the issue of multiple comparisons in a study and not adjusting for them, filing your negative findings in the bottom drawer because you don't think anyone's going to be interested in publishing them, data mining, harking, which is hypothesising after the results are known. This whole area has got some marvellous acronyms like harking and carking and so forth. Data snooping, so looking at your data before you've actually completed your recruitment. Selective outcome reporting, and p-hacking. So in other words, just looking and looking and looking until you get a p-value that falls over the 0.05 level. So I think what's interesting about this is that this sort of research has shown us that maybe the emphasis is on the left-hand side rather than the right. And the sort of internal drivers that we maybe haven't thought about so much might be important. So researcher lack of knowledge, people being really keener to be first than right, and that there are no consequences for lack of reproducibility. And if these are the issues, then the solutions are different. So we need to be educating researchers about research methods, we need to work in teams, and we need to improve research governance. These are not new messages. So Douglas Altman, 25 years ago, said that researchers feel compelled for career reasons to carry out research that they are ill-equipped to perform and nobody stops them. And John Ioannidis, 5 years ago, said although physicians must pass rigorous examinations to practice medicine, they can practice medical research with nearly no training. Now, that's about researchers. What about journals? And you've heard, I think, a lot of very good advice about what journals can do, but I think the future for journals is very exciting. But I think we are going to have to insist on a lot more transparency and a lot of systematic reporting. And I think we're going to eventually have to change the way journals review papers. So in terms of the immediate, I think, as you've just heard from Rod, we need to improve the quality of peer review. We need to have standardisation of reporting, so using the consort statement and Prospero, etc. And we need to be very wary of the problems of plagiarism and fraud. The future, transparency, data sharing, this is a whole new world of shared science. And I think eventually we will do away with what we would now call a single wrap-up publication. If you don't think there's a problem with peer review, I think publications like this hopefully might show you that there is a problem. So this group wrote a spoof paper about a new chemical that they said had anti-cancer properties extracted from a lichen. And they were not subtle about this at all. The author was someone called Okarafu Kabanji from the Wasi Institute of Medicine. That does not exist. The methods were deliberately flawed, the results were meaningless, and they submitted this paper to 304 open access journals, and it was accepted by half of them. Very quickly, it was accepted by half of them. In many cases, it didn't appear to have been peer-reviewed. Even where it was apparently peer-reviewed, the editor often accepted it anyway. I might add that it was accepted by journals which fall within relatively highly reputable stables. So this isn't just the junk journals we're talking about. It was accepted by journals publishing in very different fields. PLOS 1 rejected it on ethical and methodological grounds, you'll be reassured to know. So if a journal accepted the paper, the authors rapidly withdrew it, saying they'd found a fatal error. Now, 1/3 of the journals that accepted it were in India, but the next biggest group were based in the US. Just a brief comment about fraud. Again, this is not a small problem. So in April last year, Springer retracted 107 papers from a highly reputable journal called Tumour Biology. Now, China recently took disciplinary action against a very large number of researchers, including, so this was for fraud, and the disciplinary action included having their funding frozen and being denied access to future funding for various periods of time. And I understand the law in China has been changed to make fabrication of scientific data punishable by imprisonment or even potentially execution. I think this is an interesting suggestion. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Eric Topol, who's the editor-in-chief of Medscape, and he has actually suggested that if a study is found not to be reproducible, then the researchers might need to refund the research money. I think if that was a consequence of lack of reproducibility, it would focus people's attention. And I'm not just having a go at China about the issue of fraud. This is a paper about 58 articles by Iranian scientists over the issue of authorship manipulation. Now, I said at the beginning I would come back to systematic reviews. So there's real concern about what's seen as the explosion in systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Once upon a time, they were seen as the absolute pinnacle of the design pyramid, and we're now seeing what's called network systematic reviews, and you've heard a bit about those at this meeting. This is where trials are integrated to examine effectiveness of interventions that have never been directly compared. But the problem is that there are now so many systematic reviews being done. They're often commissioned by companies, particularly pharmaceutical companies. They're commissioned to companies that do reviews. The problem is people aren't registering these reviews, so we've got no idea what proportion of the total number of reviews are actually being published, and we know that selective publication is a problem. Often they're overlapping, and what's very clear is that there are many reviews in the same area coming to different conclusions. So one example is that in a 7-year period, there were 185 meta-analyses just of antidepressants. And the issue is that these reviews are not really helping us change the decisions that we're making clinically. So we've really got to think about what we're doing, publishing all of these systematic reviews. So I think what we need to think about is producing more high quality trials. We need to introduce this concept of living systematic reviews, so you don't just do a systematic review and leave it and maybe review it a couple of years later, but you actually update it as new data becomes available. I think this is a very exciting concept and it's really starting to happen. What it will require, though, is for us to think about how we're going to acknowledge authorship of reviews that actually change over time and have many people contributing to them. So the future, I think we might end up with two-stage peer review, so peer review of the protocol before the results are known and then peer review afterwards. This will stop some of this stuff called harking and carking. I think this idea that you get pre-publication comment is very important, and also post-publication comment. So things like on PubMed Commons. So we will do away with this single wrap publication. But we will have to think about how we attribute credit in this sort of new world situation. Just to come to the end of what I wanted to say, I think we need to be really mindful that, you know, we can understand why the public might lose faith in a situation where we can see that the reproducibility of science is really problematic. And I think it's interesting that in particle physics, it's absolutely accepted that researchers check each other's work prior to publication and that good criticism is openly rewarded. And particle physicists say they do this because the stakes are so high. Well, I would suggest that in medical practice, the stakes are pretty high as well. Thank you. And this is just one of the many pictures you will see of Melbourne during this conference, just to remind you to please come to Melbourne in 2020. Thank you.